My name is Yahn Nemirovsky. My pronouns are they, them, or he, him. I'm education coordinator at the Textile Museum of Canada. Today, I'm going to give you some introductory techniques for mending with sewing. I personally really enjoy sewing by hand, and so having these sort of rudimentary skills for being able to mend our clothing by hand is very helpful, especially if we don't have a sewing machine at home. So this will be a nice workshop, especially for folks who aren't so familiar with sewing. You'll get some introduction to a running stitch, a back stitch, as well as an invisible stitch that can be used on a hem to repair it. And then I'll also demonstrate the sewing of a button too. Tabletop. So I have a few different items that I'm going to be mending today, and I'm going to be sort of mocking the damage or the wear that is existing on these items because they were not worn. I just thought that they would be nice examples to work with for this teach-in. So this is a button-down shirt made with a pretty lightweight cotton. It's a woven fabric, and it will be nice for sewing by hand. And then I also have this button-down shirt. It's made with linen. It's this beautiful bright green color, although it looks quite washed out on my screen just now. And it has some what look to be maybe home sewn details. Perhaps this shirt was shortened by someone who purchased it and then added their own hem at the bottom there. So that's fun. It's also kind of mismatching when you button it up. The two the two ends of the shirt don't quite line up, which I find quite cute actually. But this is another garment that I'll be showing you some stitching on. And then finally, I have this pair of denim carpenter pants, and this I'll be using to show you mending some top stitch, which is quite simple, but very fun. And I have some colorful cotton yarns to be using for that top stitching. So the first thing that I'm going to show everyone is just how to mend a seam that has a bit of a tear. So when I'm looking at the inside of this seam, and I'm going to move this little window out of the way so I can see what you see. When I look at the inside of this seam, this is a store-bought shirt that has serged edges, and it has serged edges so that the fabric in the shirt doesn't fray. So there is a serged edge on this seam, as well as a line of sewing that is integral to the structure of the garment. So the serging is just for mainly protection, and then the line of sewing is for its structural integrity as a shirt. It is what is binding the two pieces of fabric here together to give the shirt its shape. And I have taken my seam ripper for the purpose of this demonstration, and I've broken just the line of sewing in the seam here, just the straight line of sewing, so that I can show you how to repair that. So this will be quite an introductory look at mending by hand. And yeah, I just want to give folks a look at how to do this at home if you don't have a machine. So what I'm going to do is I'm basically just going to replicate the same line of sewing that already exists for the rest of the seam. And I'm going to do this over the part that has been broken with maybe an inch or a half an inch of stitching overlapping the sewing that is still intact. So that's an important part of this process, is making sure that your mending stitching is overlapping stitching that is still intact, so that it has something to grasp onto and so that it won't come apart again. And I'm currently just taking a little knot out of my thread. All right. So to do this, I have taken some sewing thread. This is an all-purpose sewing thread that is normally used for machine sewing, but I'm using it for hand sewing because it's quite sturdy. I've got a little sewing needle. It's got a little eye. You could use sort of whatever size needle is most comfortable for you. And I'm taking out another knot there that just formed. But I would recommend that you use a needle that has a sharp tip rather than a blunt tip. And that's because we need it to be pointy. We need it to be able to pierce our fabric easily and get under some small areas. And having a sharp tip will help us with that. So I'm going to go about a ½ inch away from, this is where the tear in the seam is, and this sewing is still intact. So I'm going to go about a ½ inch away from where the tear has begun. I'm going to go in and out of that sewing. This is on the inside of the shirt. I apologize for the Outlook inbox beep. So I'm going to ground my thread there. I've got a couple of knots in the end of that thread that are just resting against the fabric now. And to do a bit of extra grounding, though this may not be sound in the way that many crafts people would hope it to be, this is a way that I'm going to show you that's quite easy to do another knot in this area to make sure that this is secure. So I've just placed my needle under 1 or 2 threads of this woven fabric just beside where my knot from my thread has nestled in there. And I'll see that I have a loop created before I pull that thread completely tight. I'm passing my needle under that. That's just to make an additional knot against the seam there to make sure I'm ready to go. And ideally, when I would have done that, that last knot grounding the thread in the seam there, I would have hooked my needle under the thread of the sewing that is still intact within the shirt. So making sure that there is a knot that is attaching the sewing that is still intact with my new thread so that everything is locked in. And then I'm going to imitate the stitching already present in the shirt with a running stitch. So a running stitch is just sewing, putting your needle in and out of the fabric, or in this case, the 2 pieces of fabric making up the seam at equal intervals, creating a sort of dotted line or a dashed line of sewing. You could also do backstitch for this part. I'll show you that as well. Doesn't have to be perfect. I'm just trying to make sure that my sewing is in line with the sort of perforations that exist from the stitches that used to be there that are now broken to replicate the seam that used to be there. And then I'm going to, same thing as how I started, I'm going to go about a ½ inch past where the sewing that's still intact is existing in this seam to make sure that it's grounded to something, the sewing that I've done, that has something to hold on to, that it's more secure. And I just had a little bit of a knot pull there, so I'm just going to tug at that with my needle until it comes free. Sometimes that's all it takes. Oh, and it wanted to form again. So I'm just kind of tugging at that until it comes free, and then it's fine. I'm straightening out my fabric to make sure it's not bunching up and my stitching isn't getting too tight. And I'm carrying on about a ½ inch into the part of the sewing that's still intact. And I'm not sure if my camera is quite focusing there, is it? but then I'm going to end just about the same way that I began. And I'm going to put my needle into the fabric, and under a piece of thread in the sewing that's still intact, there's going to be a large loop created before I pull all of that thread tight against the fabric, and I'm going to loop my needle through that, just catching it, and that creates a small knot. And I'm going to do that a couple of times to make sure that my thread is secure. So I'm moving just a couple millimeters away from where I just did that knot, putting my needle under a couple pieces, a couple threads of this woven fabric, as well as a thread of the sewing of the seam that's still intact from previously. There's a loop created. I'm putting my needle into the loop, and then I'm pulling that tight. And then what I might do to kind of have this loose end grounded or darned in somewhere rather than just hanging out, I'm going to put my needle just under stitches from the sewing that's still intact to kind of darn it in there. And then I'll cut it off.
Yahn, is there a way you could use a contrasting thread? Some folks are having a hard time seeing the stitching.
Of course, I will try that next. So I may have to use a thicker, like one of my my little cotton yarns here to demonstrate, which isn't quite the material that I would choose for this regularly, but for the purpose of demonstration, I am happy to do that. Find a larger needle here. So this thread I would normally use for top stitching because it's so thick. Unless you want to do mending of your seams and hems that is quite visible and kind of funky, then this is something that you could work with. And I've chosen a larger needle. I'm gonna do the YouTube moment. Does that make it focus? This is a larger needle anyway, and it has a larger eye for this yarn or thread to fit through. And when you're sewing by hand, it's often recommended that you choose a length of thread to work with that's about that of your forearm, so that it doesn't become knotted too easily, like how mine was knotted on its own. Okay, here I'm going to show you this running stitch in the seam with this new thread. So I'm just going to imagine that there's a broken area of my seam here, even though I've just mended it. I'm tying a couple of knots into the end of this thread that's going to be resting against the seam. Okay. So I'll show you just beside that. I'm going to enter the seam, just the sewn part of the seam here. I'm going to go into the fabric and then come back up just a few millimeters away. Now this is a little bit awkward because this needle is quite large and so is the yarn, but we'll make it work. So a running stitch is just this line of sewing that looks like a dashed line. That's much easier to see. Thank you for that, for that feedback. Okay. And then I'll show you what finishing that sort of line of sewing with a knot looks like with this orange now. So I I'm putting my needle under a couple of threads of the woven fabric, as well as a thread from the sewing that's still intact in that seam, smaller than the stitches were for my running stitch there. I've got a loop that forms with my thread here that I'm going to put my needle through, catch it, and pull. And that's a sort of finishing knot, and I would do a couple of those to make sure that my thread is secure. So I'll do another one there. I've gone under the thread from the original sewing, as well as a couple of threads of the woven fabric. There's a loop created. I catch it with my needle, and I pull that tight, and that's it there. And then I'm going to darn in this thread underneath the sewing that's still intact in the shirt. So just going underneath these stitches, and I alternate from going up and down and up and down, so it creates this kind of squiggly line. The purpose of this is just to make sure that there's no flyaway kind of going everywhere, which, you know, there is with this, but if you really wanted to, you could begin with darning in your thread before you introduce your knotting too, if you want it to be really quite seamless. I say seamless when we're mending a seam. So that's what that looks like. And then if we look at the other side of our seam, so actually the orange doesn't show through too much. You can tell that it's a little bit more textured because of the way that the fabric is kind of puckering around it, and only when I pull on it do I see that orange there. But with my mending with the pale thread, you do see a little bit of my handwork there, but it's not as prominent. So that's mending with running stitch. All right, and okay, I can show you just very quickly, not in a way that I would actually adjust this garment, but just to demonstrate the technique for you. Backstitch, rather than existing as a dashed line, is sort of like a dashed line with the spaces filled in. So if we imagine that I began by having a knot in the bottom of my yarn or thread and beginning sewing, backstitch looks a lot like running stitch, but just, yeah, with those spaces filled in. So I began by just doing one line of sewing as if it were running stitch, but then I took a bit of a pause and I came up in my fabric the length, the distance, which I wanted to be the length of the stitch to exist there. And then I came back into where the previous stitch ended. So let's say I'm looking to put a stitch here. I want to mimic the length. Can you see that? I want to mimic the length of this stitch and come up from the back of the fabric that distance away. So I want to come up from the back of the fabric there and enter where the previous stitch ended to create my back stitch. So this is a more secure line of sewing than running stitch, and it's a technique that you can use for the same means of mending that I just demonstrated, mending a seam. It might make your mending a bit less visible because it is stronger, so it'll be less likely that you'll be able to see the handwork when pulling the two pieces of fabric from the seam apart a little bit, pulling at them, putting tension on them. My hands are in the wrong spot. Okay. So that's what backstitch looks like. And now I'll have this fun decoration at the bottom of this shirt that won't be very secure because I haven't knotted it, but I think that's fun. It's also not very straight. Okay, that is backstitch. If anyone wants me to repeat anything that I've shown or anything that I'll show later, please do let me know, and I'll be happy to. Or if my hands are way over here and you can't see anything, please do let me know too. Okay, the next thing that I'm going to show you, and I'm going to do that with also this orange because it's easier to see, although it won't be invisible. It is called invisible stitch, but it won't be invisible. But perhaps this will help you get a sense of what this technique is like and how it's used. So what are we going to do? We're going to look at the hem. So the hem is the sort of line of stitching that exists around the bottom of a garment, whether it be a shirt or a skirt or a dress or pants. The hem is rolled over, turned under, so that the raw fabric at the bottom of the garment isn't exposed, and then it's pressed so that that fold is crisp, and then it is sewn in place. And there are a number of different ways that hems are sewn. So this hem has just been sewn with a machine, just a straight line of sewing just along the edge. This is looking at the inside of the garment. This is the outside. So on the outside of the garment, it just, well, this fabric is a little bit translucent. So you can see the area of the fabric that's been folded there just because it's more opaque than this translucent part of the fabric. But there's a line of white straight stitch machine sewing there that is keeping the hem in place. And some hems are invisible. That is something that I'm going to show you right now, because you already now in this workshop we've covered backstitch, which is something that you could use to be mending this this straight line of stitching as seen here, as well as running stitch. You could use that too for this, but I'm going to show you invisible stitching. So this invisible stitch takes a little bit of fabric from just above the part that's folded in the hem, and then a larger chunk of fabric from the part that is folded, because you can hide your thread and your needle while you're stitching inside this fold and use that to your advantage to keep the hem structurally sound. So it's invisible in that it is taking a very, very small amount of fabric with the needle on the visible side of the fabric, and it is hiding a lot of its structure inside the folded part of the hem. So I'm going to thread my needle here, and I'm going to show you what that can look like. And zig thread, okay. And then I'm going to tie a knot in the bottom, the end of my thread here. I'm going to get out of my crouching position on this chair because it's quite uncomfortable. And I'm going to show you a little bit of this invisible stitch. So where's a nice part to work with here? I'm going to go for this sort of straighter cut area. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to, and it might not work because this thread is so thick, but I'm going to try and place my needle into this folded hem area to hide my knot inside it. So first, just grounding my thread inside this folded hem area. So what I'm going to do is pull this little bit of hem back here, and maybe you can't do that, and then you can just sort of go into it, making sure that you don't put your needle through the outermost layer of fabric, only in the area that's folded. But since I have access to being able to fold this over a little bit. I'm gonna use that. And I'm just going to put my needle into it and come out from it just at the very brim of the fold of the hem there. And make sure it's not doing anything funky there. Okay. And then I'm going to pull my thread, but not all the way through. I want my knot to go through this area where I've pierced the fabric, but I don't want it to come through the second area where it's then coming out. So I have to be a little bit careful in pulling this. Nope, it's not going to come through. It's too thick. But if I were using sewing thread, I might be able to accomplish that. And then my knot would remain hidden inside this folded part of the hem. But since this was too thick to do that, I'm just going to tuck the threads from the end there, the little tail, inside the folded part of the hem there for now. And that'll be good enough for me for this purpose. Okay, and so to do this invisible stitch, it's not completely invisible, though it can get quite close, depending on your technique. And maybe you don't necessarily want it to be invisible, but you just want it to be less than a running stitch or less than a back stitch. So this could work for you well. So I'm going to move a few millimeters away from where my thread has come up here. I'm going to put my needle into the more translucent part here. This is just the fabric that is facing the outside world. It has no hem here, and I'm going to go just above where the folded part of the hem ends into just the outermost layer of fabric, and I'm going to try and grab just a few threads of that woven fabric there, so that it's sort of barely hanging on. And that's where the invisible part comes into play there. And then I'm going to come up about the same distance that I just traveled from here to here. Can you see that? About the same distance that I just traveled from here to here. I'm going to come up into the folded part of the hem, and I'm going to take a longer stitch hidden inside the folded part of the hem there, because it's going to not be visible, so I can make it as long as I want to make sure that it's hanging on well. So I'm going to go for that length, and that my needle is currently hidden inside the folded part of the hem, just at the edge there. And pull that through. And then we're going to repeat that same process. So we're going to grab a little bit of the outermost fabric and then go back into the folded part of the hem. So I'm going to move a few millimeters over, grab some of the outermost fabric, just a tiny, tiny amount. And then I'm going to move a few millimeters over, put my needle into the folded part of the hem, do quite a long stitch there because I can, and pull that. And that is how we do an invisible hem. I'll show you some more of that, but first I want to look at the back of this. So I don't know if you can even see that on Zoom, but there's a tiny little orange dot there and a tiny little orange dot there. And if we were doing this with sewing thread, it would be essentially invisible. I'm just going to check the chat here. So we have a comment that a participant has tried this before, but the front side stitching always shows up, even when just taking a few threads of front fabric, and it always puckers, always looks bad. So one thing that I do to make sure that my fabric isn't puckering is I'm actually, and I do this instinctively, so sometimes I forget when I'm when I'm facilitating workshops to explain everything that's happening with my hands, but I'm actually holding this intention. My pointer finger and middle finger here are holding this fabric, and then my thumb and pinky finger are holding it over here, and they're holding this tight. So I am making sure that my thread is in a tension that matches that of the fabric, and yeah, always making sure it's taut and they're matching. Neither is tighter than the other. And yeah, I think that this technique certainly takes some practice. And it will be visible to some extent, especially depending on the fabric of the garment that you're working with, depending on the thread that you've chosen. There's, I mean, there is a little tiny bit of a grab on there, and there has to be for the structural integrity of the technique. So it might be visible by just a little blip here and there, but perhaps it's something that might change with practice, or perhaps that's just something that you have to weigh when you're considering what technique to be using. Are you okay with these little dots around the hem of your garment? And do you prefer that over a straight line of stitching? So try and show you up close another time what this invisible stitch is looking like. So I'm going a couple or a few millimeters above, maybe even like a half centimeter. Concept of a centimeter in my brain and near my hands out in the world without a ruler beside me is not here. I'm grabbing a few little threads of this outermost fabric, and then I'm placing my needle into the fold of the hem for quite a long stitch, and then I carry on. And on my fabric, I can see orange dots, which could be cute, maybe. But it's certainly more invisible than, if you're looking at this, for example. All right. So another thing that I'm going to show you is how to sew a button onto a garment. So when you're sewing a button, maybe this is just for decorative purpose, or maybe it's for a functional purpose. If it's for a functional purpose, you want to make sure that you have the placement of your button planned out. You could be marking this, or maybe you've measured it out and you have your button just stuck on there with your finger and you're ready to go. And what I'm going to do is just sort of place a button that doesn't need to be on the shirt in between two buttons that already exist for the purpose of demonstration. So this is quite simple, and maybe the most challenging part of this could be getting the button tight enough to the fabric and maybe securing it afterwards. So I am tying a couple of knots in the end of my thread there. And normally I would use a sewing thread that's not as thick as this. I'd be using a smaller needle as well. But I'm going to just hold my button in place on the front of my fabric where I want to place it, just with my thumb and pointer finger. And then I'm going to put my needle in through the button from the back of the fabric. And I sort of look back and forth between the front and back to know where I should place my needle so that it goes through one of the button's holes. And with this button, there's just two holes. So I go into the next one, and then I'm going to repeat that a few times until I feel it's secure enough. And I kind of caught onto my thread there for a second, but I've since pulled it tight. And I think this will be cute, even though it's not going to have a hole. I was including this as part of this workshop with the idea that perhaps your button has fallen off. Perhaps you're looking to replace it. Here, I don't really have a reason for any of what is happening here apart from sharing. And that's fine. And this thread is coming through to the front somehow, so I'm just picking at it to see what's up and pulling at it until it comes back where I want it to be. And there you go, I fixed that. So many of my hand sewing frustrations seem to be able to be fixed by just picking at them with my needle. And you know what? I'm fine with that. So now I'm just looking, I'm doing this without even looking at the back because I can sort of poke around from the back of my fabric until I see that, yes, my needle is coming through the hole in the button. And I'm gonna go back in there one more time, and that is secured. And then to tie this off, I am going to place my needle under both some of this fabric as well as some of these stitches to anchor it. And before that loop gets pulled tight, I'm going to hook my needle through it and then pull tight. And I might do this a few times. Do folks have any particular mending interests that they'd like to share? Anything they're looking to learn? I can't promise that it's something that I'll be able to cover within this workshop, but just out of interest, what are you looking to learn in the mending world? What are you looking to do with mending? I personally, I'll share, I like to buy a lot of my clothing secondhand, and some of that clothing that I buy secondhand has some damage to it. And so I find it nice to be able to just purchase that and then make those sort of repairs on my own. The clothing is cheaper than purchasing new often, especially for the quality. Yeah, and often the pieces that are in need of repair being sold at secondhand shops and thrift shops, they might be overlooked by some because they might not have access to the means to repair them, or they might not have knowledge of the skills that they need, or maybe the materials. But I hope that some of these mending techniques with sewing can help you do the same kind of thing.
Hi, Yahn. We have a couple questions in the chat.
Sure.
So the first one is, when do you use double thread and when do you use single thread?
Ooh, I guess that's a personal choice. I like to use single thread almost all the time because I find that when I double my thread up, it knots more easily. So that's just a personal preference. So I think what is being referenced here is, here I'm just going to thread this needle very slowly. So when you're sewing by hand, you can have your needle threaded with a little tail hanging off the end there, and then just this one thread is going into the work and doing the sewing. Or you can double it up by pulling that tail to match the other end of thread, and then you can create your knot there, and then you've got two strands of thread going into the work doing the sewing. And especially when I'm working with like a very thin, just like a classic sewing thread, I find this frustrates me more easily. So I personally prefer to do this. And some people prefer not to do this because then you have to watch this tail and you have to watch that it doesn't sort of slip away on you. But I like that. I think that my hand is just used to looking for the tail and holding it with me. Yeah.
And Vida has a visual question, which is, I want to repair a worn out collar of an ancient shirt. So could you show us the shirt?
Amazing.
Okay, let's see. Can you see me?
We can spotlight you, I believe.
So this was a shirt that belonged to my great uncle. It's sort of a fetish object. And I still wear it, but as you can see, the collar is all worn out here.
Okay.
And I'm wondering if it would be better to actually add a patch, or is there some kind of fancy stitching that I can do?
Do you mind bringing the collar a bit closer to the camera for a second? Okay. Is there batting in between are there two layers of fabric happening there and one is broken and one is intact?
There was.
Yeah.
So there would have been right here, but it's so worn out that here's just one layer.
Yeah. You could certainly use a patch to be mending that. Our next workshop, which actually Ali is going to be hosting, is going to cover the technique of sashiko,
Okay.
which is a technique using patches and stitching to repair garments. But another thing that you could do, and something that I just kind of do in a lot of my projects, just because I like the look of it, even though it takes a very long time, is maybe I'll switch you back to my hand so you can see. And thank you so much for sharing that. Here, I'll show you what this looks like. I'm just threading my needle for the 10th time very slowly. Okay. So when I'm going all the way around the edge of a piece of fabric that I am adhering to another piece of fabric, this is a technique that I use for applique, which is, yeah, essentially taking cutout pieces of fabric and adhering them to other fabric, using a variety of techniques. But one way that I like to do that is just surround the entire shape going into, let's imagine that this side of the stitch is going into an additional piece of fabric on top of this shirt, and this side of the stitch is just into the shirt, going all the way around the perimeter of that with stitches that are just exactly beside each other, creating this kind of thick frame. So I imagine what I would do with that collar, if it, you know, based on just my own creative interest, I would probably go around all of the areas of that top piece of fabric that's breaking, go around that perimeter with stitching just like this, and that would create this outline that highlights where the fabric has been damaged and where it has worn out, sort of preserving the way that the shirt has been worn without covering it up. That would be my own personal preference. So I would go all the way around a shape like that. And maybe I can draw that for you so that you have a different visual understanding of what that would look like. So let's imagine that this is the collar. This is, can you even see that? Yes, okay. This is the top piece of fabric that is still intact. For example, I don't quite remember what was intact and what was not. And this is the part where fabric has worn away. I would use stitches that go all the way around this perimeter with quite a thick thread or a thin yarn, and create this kind of decorative mending that still holds on to the shape. So that the stitches are essentially just beside each other like that. And the sort of cutoff between just fabric and then 2 layers of fabric is right down the middle in between those stitches. And then this now looks like some kind of house creature, centipede. How does that sound? What do you think of those two techniques, the stitching around the shape or the patches? What do you think?
That sounds great. Thanks a lot. The only concern I would have is that it would be really fragile to wash it or something.
Yeah, for sure. I think that with this technique, it would be much more fragile. But with sewing with patches, depending on the amount of stitching that you did to get those patches on there, it could be more durable. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm just going to look at the chat here.
We also have a question from Angela, which is, do you have any suggestions to repair a tear on a sleeve or within the fabric?
Ooh, a tear. Okay, so the tear, I would definitely be repairing with a patch. So I can show you a little bit of what that looks like. I am honestly going to use this Post-it note because I did not bring patches for this workshop, but I think that for your specific question, I will take that on. So we imagine that there's a tear in this fabric, there's a bit of a hole, there's some threads kind of fraying around it. What I would do is I would take a patch, and this could be adhered to the front, or it could be brought to the back, and my preference would probably be for the back of the fabric. And you could be sewing just with a running stitch or with a back stitch around the broken part of the fabric. You could be sewing all around the square of the patch. You could be doing running stitch up and down. You could be doing running stitch in this direction, or just about anything with a very simple stitch to make sure that the patch is adhered to the fabric and that there is enough secure stitching around the hole that has been made in the fabric that it's not going to fray anymore. So sometimes that might look like surrounding the entire hole of a fabric with stitching. So if we imagine that this, and I'll show this a bit closer up in a second, if we imagine that this is a hole in a fabric, then we could be doing stitching all the way around it, and then making sure that it's secure, and then carrying on with any other stitching that we want to be doing to make sure that the patch is adhered. Ali, do you have any input that you want to share right now? Unless you're busy. Ali is also on site in our Textile Learning Hub. So I'm not sure what if they're up to anything right now. They might be. But if you join us on October 13th, you'll be able to get some insight from them on using patches for mending. There's a suggestion in the chat that the shirt that you brought up, Vida, could be turned into a colorless shirt as well. That's another fun way to work with garments that have damage to them is reimagining them too. But I do understand the potential importance of preserving a family heirloom. All right, is there anything else that anyone would like to see during the program today? Is there anything you'd like to see again? Any ideas you'd like to share? There's a chat. You mentioned needles with sharp tips versus blunt tips earlier. When would you use which? So blunt tip needles, and I don't have any with me today, but they are often larger. They're often looking kind of like this with a quite a large eye, and then yeah, without a sharp tip, having a blunt tip instead. And I have some really large ones at home that are quite fun. I'll be using blunt tip needles when I'm doing mending with knitting in November. So using the blunt tip is when you don't want to be piercing fabric, when you want to be just using the needle as a way of sort of organizing yarns to be able to get the tool through to where it needs to go. So you also use a blunt tip needle, or many folks do, for cross stitch. So you don't need to be piercing much during cross stitch, often because you're either using Aida cloth, which already has holes, or you're using maybe a woven fabric with a heavy grid structure that doesn't necessarily need to be pierced because it's already organized in such a way that the needle can pass through it easily. But with mending, with sewing, with doing running stitch and backstitch and the invisible hem stitch I showed, as well as sewing buttons, it's helpful to have a needle with a sharp tip because you're often going to be sewing with a fabric that isn't organized in the way that you need it to be. And especially with the hem stitch, you need to have a sharp tip to be able to grasp onto a tiny amount of threads in the woven fabric to move forward with as part of the invisible part of the stitch. If I were to do this with a blunt tip needle, it would be far more difficult, as well as the running stitch and the back stitch. Even that would be more difficult because when I'm doing running stitch, I like to go in to the back and back out to the front of my fabric in one motion. And if I had a blunt needle, maybe this inward motion wouldn't be so bad, but coming back up through the fabric to the front might be a little tricky, might need a little more force, and unnecessary force when working that, with repeated motion might cause tension in my wrist. We want to be looking out for our wrists and our eyes when we're sewing. Yeah, so it's just for ease of use, depending on what you're using it for. Great. All right. What else can I do to these things? Ooh, we can do top stitch within the last 15 minutes because I forgot about it until I saw this flash of blue in the corner of my eye. So top stitch is it's just back stitch, but with a fun visible thread. So I'm going to use some pink on these blue pants, and I'm going to do some back stitch just over top of the white stitching that's already existing. We could imagine that maybe some of it has broken free. And then once again, I would just make sure to do some of my work over at least a ½ inch or maybe an inch of stitching that's still intact to make sure that it's grasping onto something strong and sturdy, something that isn't going to move when we're mending. But here I am not going to pierce the top stitch in these ones for this purpose because these are my babies. Okay. And you know what? To begin, I'm probably going to darn into the back of this. So I'm going to, even without using a knot, I'm going to go underneath several stitches, and I'm going to have a little tail sitting up there that I'm going to also darn into this line of stitching here. So I do that just by, when I catch on to this line of sewing that's already existing here, this top stitching, I also make sure to have my needle underneath the little tail of thread that I'm introducing here when I do my stitching. And this is a technique that a lot of craftspeople use to eliminate the use of knots. Traditionally in cross stitching, it's supposed to be that you don't have any knots in your work, and that the back of your work is supposed to look pristine. And I don't necessarily believe in that, but I do like the idea of not having a bulky knot in the pocket at the back of my pants. So that's why I'm choosing to do this. And I have effectively darned that little tail into my stitching there just as I've moved along, and then I'm ready to go. So I might want to do that, maybe a ½ inch away from where I'd be starting, and then also take into account the ½ inch that I want to be using to cover up stitching that's already intact. But here, I'm just going to copy the stitches that already exist. And then I'm going to do backstitch. So from the back of the fabric, I'm going to come up where the next stitch ends. And that looks tiny on the screen. Can I turn down the contrast here? Or turn up the contrast, I guess. Yes, I can. All right. And it took a bit of poking around with the needle to get to exactly where that stitch ends, but I found it and I'm copying the exact same placement. And potentially if the top stitching that you're working with has been damaged, you won't see the thread there anymore, but maybe you'll see perforations in the garment, which you can copy, or maybe you just have to judge by the length of the stitches that exist elsewhere in the garment. Or maybe you don't care to replicate it as it was, and that's fine too. But thank you all for joining me anyway. Yeah. Thank you so much.